My death comes without apology, and I welcome the Valkyries to summon me home!
Vikings were not just the fierce warriors we often hear about. They were also traders, explorers, and seafarers who valued honor and community. But it might be surprising to learn that despite their reputation for chaos, they had a complex legal system. This system wasn't just about keeping order. It was about upholding the values they cherished. When someone crossed the line, the punishments were as harsh and unforgiving as the Viking landscape itself. From punishments that guaranteed death to tortures that left one longing for it, here are the merciless and cruel punishments that Vikings used in their time. Number 10. Outlawry. Outlawry, known as skoganger in Old Norse, was one of the most severe forms of punishment in Viking society. It wasn't just a legal sentence, it was a form of social death. When someone was declared an outlaw, they were literally put outside the protection of the law, stripped of their rights, and left to fend for themselves in a harsh and unforgiving world. In Viking communities, crimes like murder, rape, kidnapping, or even practicing malevolent sorcery could lead to outlawry. The decision to declare someone an outlaw was made during the Thing, an open-air assembly where free men gathered to make laws and decide on serious cases. If someone was found guilty of a grievous crime, the community would declare them an outlaw, meaning they were now outside the law. There were two types of outlawry: full outlawry and lesser outlawry. Full outlawry, or skoganger, was a lifelong sentence. The individual was banished from society forever, becoming a skogarmadur, or man of the forest. This meant they had to live in isolation, often in the wilderness, away from all human contact. Their property was confiscated, and anyone who encountered them could kill them without facing any legal consequences. Lesser outlawry, on the other hand, lasted for 3 years. After this period, the outlaw could potentially be reintegrated into society, though this was a rare occurrence. Both types of outlawry were devastating not just because of the physical challenges of surviving alone, but also due to the complete loss of social identity and support. In Viking culture, being part of a family or a community was everything. To be cut off from this network was a fate worse than death for many. Outlawry also had deep cultural implications. The Vikings viewed law and society as inseparable. The phrase var lug, meaning our law, was often used to refer to society itself. To be declared an outlaw was to be stripped of all ties to family, friends, and tribe, essentially becoming a non-person. Some famous Viking figures like Eric the Red and Grettir Asmundarson were outlaws, and their stories highlight the harsh realities of life outside the law. Their stories also highlight the occasional heroic feats that these individuals achieved despite their status. Number 9. Fatal Walk. The fatal walk, a method so grim it could only be born in an era as harsh as the Viking Age, involved the victim being led around a tree, but this wasn't a simple march. It began with the victim's abdomen being sliced open, exposing their intestines. From there, a length of intestine was pulled out and affixed to the base of a tree. As the victim was forced to walk around the tree, their intestines slowly unraveled from their body, wrapping around the tree in a grotesque spiral. Death was inevitable but excruciatingly slow, with the victim remaining conscious and aware as their life was literally unwound. One of the most famous accounts of the fatal walk comes from the Njal saga. In this saga, a Viking mercenary named Brewer faced the fatal walk after betraying the Irish High King Brian Boru. As Brewer walked, his intestines uncoiled from his body, wrapping around the tree until he collapsed from shock and blood loss. This horrific execution was carried out by Wolf the Quarrelsome, Brian Boru's avenger, ensuring Brewer's betrayal was repaid with unparalleled cruelty. But Brewer wasn't the only one to meet such a grisly end. In another tale, found in Ormstatur Storolfssonar, a character named Asbjorn was subjected to the fatal walk after an unfortunate encounter with a troll named Brusi. Brusi, proving that the Vikings' foes could be as terrifying as the Vikings themselves, sliced open Asbjorn's belly, tied his intestines to an iron column, and forced him to walk around it. Asbjorn, in true Viking fashion, composed and recited verses as he walked, embodying the stoic bravery that Viking warriors were renowned for. The fatal walk wasn't just a method of execution, it was a performance of power and pain, meant to instill fear in all who witnessed or heard of it. The victim's survivability was minimal. The sheer physical trauma, combined with the psychological torment, made this one of the most dreaded forms of Viking punishment. However, it's worth noting that despite the vividness of these accounts, concrete archaeological evidence for the fatal walk is scarce. Much of what we know comes from sagas, which were as much about storytelling as they were about recording history. Interestingly, similar forms of disembowelment appear in other medieval literature, often as a motif for saintly suffering or divine punishment. This suggests that the fatal walk might have been more than just a method of Viking punishment. It could also have been influenced by the broader European narrative of suffering and penance. The Vikings, known for adopting and adapting elements from other cultures, might have incorporated this gruesome practice into their own repertoire of punishments. Number 8. Blood Eagle. When it comes to Viking lore, few rituals evoke as much dread as the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle wasn't just an execution, it was a spectacle, a ritualized display of vengeance and honor. The victim, often a captured enemy or a traitor, would be bound face down, with their hands and legs securely tied to prevent any movement. Then, in a horrifying sequence, the executioner would begin by carving an eagle-shaped incision into the victim's back, a symbol both poetic and terrifying. The process didn't end there. The next step was far more gruesome. Using a sharp axe, the executioner would sever the ribs from the spine one by one, pulling them outward to create the impression of wings. But the true horror lay in what came next. The victim's lungs were then pulled out through the open wound and draped over these wings. This creates the illusion of a bird preparing to take flight. It's said that the victim remained alive, conscious, and fully aware throughout much of this ordeal, though death inevitably followed due to blood loss, shock, or suffocation. But why such a brutal method? The Blood Eagle was not merely about killing, it was about sending a message. The Vikings believed that this ritual honored Odin, the god of war, while simultaneously marking the victim as dishonorable, beyond redemption. It was a fate reserved for those who had committed heinous acts, such as betrayal or murder, particularly against one's family.
I've been told your god is a carpenter. And guess what? So am I.
For instance, the infamous Ivar the Boneless reportedly used the Blood Eagle on King Aella of Northumbria, avenging his father Ragnar Lothbrok's death.
Mi father has to my way done a gold and silver. Not be sure, but those shall get them.
The sagas also tell of other noble victims, like King Edmund of England and Halfdan, the son of King Haraldr of Norway, who suffered this grim fate. Historians have long debated whether the Blood Eagle was a real practice or a mythological exaggeration. Some argue that the vivid descriptions found in the sagas were likely exaggerated or even entirely fictional. Others suggest that, while the ritual may have been rare, it was indeed possible, given the Vikings' known propensity for dramatic displays of power. Recent studies have even examined the anatomical feasibility of the Blood Eagle, revealing that while it would be excruciating, it could theoretically have been carried out. Number 7. Tarring and feathering. Tarring and feathering was a punishment used by Vikings for those who committed crimes during trading missions. It wasn't a simple reprimand, but a humiliating ordeal meant to mark the offender as untrustworthy and bring shame upon them. This punishment involved covering the person in hot tar and then applying feathers to their body, creating a humiliating and painful spectacle. In the Viking Age, trading was a critical part of life. The Vikings traveled far and wide, exchanging goods and forging alliances. Trust was essential, and any breach of this trust, such as theft or betrayal during these missions, was met with severe consequences. The local thing, or assembly, often decided the fate of those who committed these crimes. Tarring and feathering became one of the methods used to enforce justice. The process began by heating the tar, which was usually made from pine resin. Once the tar was boiling, the offender would be stripped to the waist, and the hot tar was poured over their body, especially focusing on the head and upper body. The tar was thick and sticky, burning the skin and causing intense pain. The heat of the tar alone was enough to cause serious discomfort, but it was the next step that added insult to injury. After the tar was applied, the victim was rolled in a pile of feathers, or had feathers thrown over them. The feathers stuck to the tar, making the person look like a bizarre, feathered creature. This transformation wasn't just for physical pain, it was meant to ridicule the person publicly. Being paraded around in such a state, they became the target of mockery and scorn from their community. In a society that valued honor and reputation, especially in trade, being tarred and feathered was a mark of disgrace that could follow someone for the rest of their life. Tarring and feathering was not unique to Vikings, but adapted by them. It has records that stretch across centuries and different cultures. One of the earliest recorded instances of tarring and feathering dates back to the late 12th century, under the rule of King Richard I of England, who recommended it for punishing thieves. However, it became more notorious during the colonial period in America, where it was often used by mobs to punish British officials and others deemed traitors during the Revolutionary era. A notable case involved Captain John Malcolm, a British customs officer who was tarred and feathered by an angry mob in Boston in 1774. Malcolm was a known loyalist, and his actions against the American colonists made him a target. The mob not only tarred and feathered him, but also forced him to drink tea as a mockery of the hated British Tea Act. In the 18th century, this punishment saw a resurgence, particularly in America during the Revolutionary period. Notable figures like Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement.
A tar and feathering, a more severe case, where you're looking at a man who is pulled off the porch of his house. He's asked to sign the agreement.
Were also victims of tarring and feathering. Smith was attacked by a mob in 1832 in Hiram, Ohio. Thereafter, he was dragged from his home, tarred and feathered as punishment for his religious beliefs and practices. The method persisted well into the 20th century, with the last recorded case in 1981 in Northern Ireland. Elizabeth Jameson was tarred and feathered on her wedding day as punishment for her association with the British Army. Number 6. Hung meat. The Vikings were known for their brutal and inventive methods of punishment, and one of the most gruesome was the hung meat torture. This method wasn't just about physical pain, it was about sending a clear message of power and dominance. In the Hrafnkel's saga Freisgota, a particularly vivid account of this punishment is detailed. Hrafnkel, a powerful chieftain, found himself on the losing side of a legal dispute. In Viking society, legal battles were not just about justice, they were deeply tied to honor. When Hrafnkel lost his case, he was not only stripped of his power, but also subjected to a humiliating and painful punishment. His captors, seeking to demonstrate their dominance, pierced Hrafnkel's heels with knives and threaded ropes through the wounds. Then, they hoisted him and his men upside down from the rafters of his own home. The image of men hanging like butchered animals was a powerful symbol of defeat and humiliation. This method was used to ensure the victim was subdued and powerless, while his property was taken away. Remarkably, Hrafnkel survived this ordeal and later sought revenge, but the psychological and physical scars remained. This punishment wasn't random or used without reason.
So I think when we're talking about the early Viking raids, the term piracy is actually quite apt, but perhaps not in quite the way that we would understand it today.
In Viking culture, such tortures were often reserved for those who committed severe offenses, like treason, betrayal, or other acts that directly challenged the social order. The Viking sagas often highlight these punishments as a way to emphasize the importance of honor and the consequences of breaking societal rules. The hung meat method was part of a broader system of Viking justice, which was heavily focused on vengeance. In Viking society, vengeance wasn't just a personal act, it was a social duty. If someone wronged you, it was expected that you would seek revenge to restore your honor. The psychological impact of hung meat was likely as severe as the physical pain. Being strung up in such a manner, especially in a place as significant as one's own home, was designed to break the spirit of the victim. The blood rushing to the head, the excruciating pain from the pierced heels, and the inability to move or escape all contributed to a sense of utter helplessness. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a spectacle, a way to show others what would happen if they crossed the wrong person. Before we move on, here's today's subscriber's pick. Picture a time when punishments were more than just a consequence. They were a message, carved into both flesh and memory. The image you're seeing is a haunting depiction of one such method, shrouded in the terrifying lore of the Vikings, the infamous Blood Eagle. Legends speak of this punishment being reserved for the gravest of betrayals. The victim, often an enemy or a traitor, would be bound, their ribs severed from the spine and spread out to resemble wings, while their lungs were pulled from their chest. This gruesome sight was not just a death sentence. It was a spectacle, meant to echo through the ages, as a stark reminder of the cost of crossing a Viking. The chilling artistry of this method reflected the Norse belief that the body could tell a story far beyond death. But what do you think? Was this ritual a brutal display of power, or is there something more profound behind it? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Number 5. Mutilation. Mutilation was a harsh and visible form of punishment in Viking society. It wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was about marking a person for life. The scars from mutilation served as a constant reminder of their crime, ensuring that everyone who saw them knew what they had done. The Vikings used mutilation as a punishment for various crimes, particularly those that threatened the social order. Theft, especially repeated theft, was often punished by cutting off a hand or a finger. This made it clear that the person had been caught and punished, and it made future thefts more difficult. In a world where survival often depended on physical abilities, losing a hand was a severe and life-altering punishment. Mutilation wasn't limited to the hands. In some cases, ears were cut off as a punishment for lying or spreading false rumors. The missing ear served as a warning to others, showing that this person had lied in the past and could not be relied upon. In more extreme cases, mutilation could involve blinding or the removal of the nose. These punishments were usually reserved for the most serious offenses, such as betrayal or treason. The Vikings believed that these severe forms of mutilation would not only punish the individual, but also send a strong message to the community about the consequences of such crimes. The Vikings valued honor and loyalty, and mutilation was one way to enforce these values. The process of mutilation was brutal and often carried out in public. This public aspect was crucial because it wasn't just about punishing the offender, it was about deterring others from committing similar crimes. Mutilation was also used as a form of justice in cases where the victim or their family demanded retribution. The Vikings practiced a system of compensation called vergild, where the family of a victim could demand payment for the injury or death of a relative. If the offender couldn't pay, or if the crime was particularly heinous, mutilation could be used as a form of compensation. The physical loss served as a repayment for the harm done. In some cases, the punishment of mutilation was carried out with specific tools designed to inflict maximum damage while keeping the offender alive. Knives, axes, and even heated irons were used to cut off limbs or disfigure the face. The tools and methods used depended on the crime and the status of the person being punished. For example, a slave caught stealing might have their nose cut off, while a free man might lose a hand. This form of punishment was a key part of Viking law and order. It was a way to maintain control and ensure that everyone knew their place. Number 4. Enslavement. In the Viking society, if you were caught committing certain crimes like theft, failing to repay debts, or even murder, you could be forced into slavery. This wasn't just about losing freedom. It was about losing your identity and becoming property, with no rights and no control over your life. The Vikings called their slaves thralls. Thralls were often taken during raids, but they could also be created from within Viking communities. If someone stole, their punishment might be to become the slave of the person they wronged. This was a way to repay the debt in a society where trust and reputation were everything. Thralls were used for all kinds of labor. They worked the fields, cooked, cleaned, and did the hardest, most unpleasant jobs. They were at the bottom of the social ladder, with no rights to speak of. A thrall's life was harsh and often short, filled with back-breaking work and constant fear of punishment. If a thrall disobeyed or did not work hard enough, they could be beaten by their owner, who would face no consequences. Some thralls were skilled workers like blacksmiths or weavers, and their skills could sometimes earn them better treatment. However, these cases were rare. Most thralls lived and died in servitude, their lives defined by the whims of their masters. Even in death, thralls were not free. Archaeological evidence shows that thralls were sometimes buried with their masters, forced to follow them into the afterlife as they had in life. Thralls could be sold or traded like any other commodity. The Vikings had established trade networks across Europe and the Middle East, and slaves were a valuable part of this trade. Major markets like Dublin in Ireland and Hedeby in Denmark were known for their bustling slave trade, where thralls were bought and sold alongside other goods. Not all thralls came from Viking lands. The Vikings raided far and wide, capturing people from as far away as the British Isles, Eastern Europe, and even occasionally from North Africa. These captives were brought back to Scandinavia and sold into slavery, their lives forever changed by the Viking raids. The life of a thrall was harsh, but there were some protections in Viking law. For example, it was illegal to kill a thrall without just cause. If a master killed a thrall without reason, they would have to pay a fine. However, these laws did little to ease the daily suffering of thralls, who were still treated as property rather than people. Female thralls often faced even greater hardships. They were not only forced to work, but were also subjected to sexual exploitation. Many were used as concubines, and any children they bore were born into slavery. The treatment of female thralls varied, but the power dynamics always favored the master, leaving these women vulnerable and oppressed. In rare cases, a thrall could earn their freedom. This might happen if they were particularly skilled or if they had saved enough to buy their freedom. There are also records of masters freeing their thralls as a reward for loyal service. But even after gaining freedom, former thralls often remained at the edges of society, marked by their past. Number 3. The Ordeal. A Viking stands accused of theft, a crime that could tear apart the fragile trust within the community. The chieftain and the thing, the assembly of free men, debate the case. But evidence is scarce, and words are conflicting. How to find the truth? The answer is simple, yet terrifying: an ordeal. This ordeal could take several forms. One common method was the ordeal of boiling water. The accused would be forced to plunge their hand into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone or an iron ring from the bottom. The hand would then be wrapped,
their arm into the boiling hot water to retrieve the object and pull it out, after which their arm was immediately bandaged.
And after 3 days, it would be unwrapped in front of the assembly. If the wound had healed cleanly, the gods had spoken, and the person was innocent. If the wound was festering or showed signs of infection, guilt was confirmed. Another method was the ordeal of fire. Here, the accused might be required to carry a red-hot iron bar for a set distance. As with the boiling water ordeal, the condition of the wound after a few days would determine the outcome. The clean healing of the burns would indicate divine favor and innocence, while infected wounds signified guilt. Another common ordeal involved water. The accused would be thrown into a body of water, bound hand and foot. If they floated, it was considered a sign of guilt, as water was believed to reject a person who had lied. If they sank, they were seen as innocent, though this innocence might come at the cost of drowning.
The innocence of someone was determined by them drowning in the water. The idea was that the innocent person who sank would be pulled out of the water after.
These ordeals were not just about physical endurance. They were deeply rooted in the belief that the gods would protect the innocent. The idea was that divine justice would reveal itself through the healing process, showing the truth where human words and evidence could not. Even for the Vikings, who were known for their toughness, these ordeals were terrifying. They placed their fate not only in the hands of the chieftain and the thing, but also in the hands of the gods. The fear of being found guilty through an ordeal was so strong that it could sometimes drive confessions before the ordeal even took place. These were not common punishments, but were reserved for cases where no other method could resolve the truth. It was a final, desperate measure to ensure justice was served in a world where the divine was believed to play a direct role in human affairs. The ordeal as a method of justice eventually faded with the Christianization of the Viking lands, as the new faith brought different ideas of law and justice. Number 2. Cow Rodeo. If you were a Norseman in the early Middle Ages and someone disrespected your wife, how would justice be served? You'd take matters into your own hands, literally. A popular way to settle such disputes was through a duel, known as a holmgang. In Sweden and Denmark, a man who lost a duel might find himself facing a challenge that was both bizarre and terrifying: a cow rodeo. After the duel, if the victor wasn't satisfied with the bloodshed, the loser was offered one final chance to save his life. This was no ordinary contest. It involved a wild cow, a greasy tail, and a desperate grip. The cow was brought into the arena, its tail shaved and coated in grease, making it slippery and hard to hold. The man's shoes were also greased, ensuring that keeping his balance would be almost impossible. The cow, already agitated, was then flogged and prodded to provoke it further. The task was simple in theory, but daunting in practice. The man had to hold on to the cow's tail as it thrashed about, trying to escape. If he could manage to hold on for the required amount of time, his life would be spared, and as a reward, he could even keep the cow. This strange and brutal test was more than just a way to save face. It was a display of endurance and strength, a final test of whether the loser deserved to walk away alive. If he failed, it was likely he would face death anyway, either from the cow or by the hand of his opponent. Number 1. Public flogging. Public flogging in Viking society wasn't just a punishment, it was a public spectacle, a powerful deterrent meant to humiliate and physically torment those who broke the laws of their community. This brutal form of punishment was often reserved for crimes that violated the social order, such as theft, adultery, or acts that threatened the community's stability. In Viking culture, maintaining honor was everything. Even lesser crimes, if repeated, could result in this painful punishment. The flogging was typically carried out during the Thing. The offender would be tied to a post or tree, and the lashes would be administered in full view of the public. This was not just about physical pain. It was about making an example of the person, showing everyone the consequences of stepping out of line. The number of lashes varied depending on the severity of the crime, but the punishment was always designed to inflict maximum pain and suffering. The whip, often made of leather or even metal-tipped cords, would tear into the flesh, leaving permanent scars both physically and mentally. What made public flogging even more terrifying was the communal aspect of it. The entire village or community would often gather to watch, and in some cases, they might even participate by jeering or mocking the person being punished. The public nature of the flogging meant that the shame was shared with everyone, ensuring that the person would be remembered for their crime long after the wounds had healed. In some cases, the flogging could be followed by additional punishments, such as banishment or even execution if the crime was severe enough. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.